Thank you, Glenn, for the kind introduction. Yes, hello, I'm Quinn Dombrowski, and I'm going to be starting at Stanford in about a week and a half, which is a really exciting change. It feels like a homecoming for me to be coming to Stanford finally. Stanford was Shangri-La when I was 12 years old and went to a summer camp here, far, far away from my parents. Unfortunately, when I turned 18, I realized it was not actually far enough away from my parents, and so instead I went to the University of Chicago for college. It was there for 10 years, and then moved back to the West Coast and started at UC Berkeley. And my father was very disappointed in this. He really had hoped that I would end up at Stanford, and we had a very awkward first Christmas in California. So I've shared the news. He's very excited, and we're all very excited to have this change and to be re-engaging with digital humanities in a new way. So doing this DARIAH workshop too is another kind of homecoming. Insofar as at DH 2014 in Lausanne, I was invited to give a talk entitled "Who Cares About Infrastructure?" at a DARIAH workshop, a pre-conference workshop. I was jet-lagged giving this talk. Then, as now, I was leaving behind a small baby at home. And so this was a talk that reflected on some of the things that we encountered doing Project Bamboo, a Mellon-funded cyber infrastructure extravaganza that I had worked on sort of from its beginning until its demise, and sort of told the sad tale of the previous year, DH 2013. I was hoping that DARIAH would have the ability to learn from some of Bamboo's mistakes, deciding on goals and scope, being open about infrastructure, not just making it hardcore underpinning technical infrastructure, but thinking about all the things, including beverages of various varieties that can really contribute to infrastructure. Communicating, building trust by starting small and doing things that people understand and are actually useful. And then providing and publicizing opportunities for community feedback and letting people get involved to the extent that they wanted to, and try to build a community that way. All of those things that we weren't able to pull off with Bamboo. I really hope to see DARIAH not repeat those mistakes. And it worked, at least well enough for us to be here today. DARIAH still exists, which shouldn't be a surprise, but the rapid demise of Project Bamboo, it's hard to tell if these projects always have a future. Not only does it still exist, it has European Research Infrastructure Consortium status, which was something that they were working on in 2014. And it seems like DARIAH really has a robust future doing the kind of infrastructure that we meant to do with Project Bamboo in the right way. In some respects, I'll admit I was browsing the DARIAH website the other day, and I was impressed with how understandable it was for such a large and complex initiative. But it was really great to see that in some ways it's validating some of the ideas that we had for Bamboo. The idea of these virtual competency centers are kind of parallel to some working groups that we had. And the fact that advocacy was on the list as one of the options, that was something that there was a lot of interest in our early Bamboo workshops. But I think partly because it was driven by technology people, it was quickly decided that advocacy was most definitely out of scope. We're gonna build some authentication infrastructure. And so that's how it ended. So seeing that the ideas that we had for Bamboo, and seeing that there's a possibility of doing a large infrastructure project with multiple components, technical and social and small projects and large infrastructure and ways to connect all of that together, it leaves me wondering whether now is the time for broad DH infrastructure in the US. Should we be reconsidering something like Project Bamboo to bring together all of these disparate initiatives? The fact is, we still do projects largely in a one-off way, and the costs of those one-off projects are enormous. With every project, there's some degree of reuse, a library here, a library there, a bit of code. But if you read the white paper from any NEH project, there's always the line about, we have released open source code, which means it's sitting there somewhere on GitHub and probably no one's ever going to use it. And it may not even still work by the time the white paper actually gets published and anyone sees it. So arguably, this is really doing more harm than good. Generating this code that's out there, that's poorly documented and inevitably duplicated. Why are we throwing so much of our energy and our costs and our resources into these projects? What if we pursued something that looks more like DARIAH US, to focus on infrastructure, to focus on reuse? Well, as Mike mentioned, things are a little different around here. Not that funding is the only aspect to consider in thinking about infrastructure, but it's a non-trivial one. The vision for and value placed on research of any sort, let alone in the humanities, is perhaps not where it should be. And infrastructure of any sort requires long-term thinking and planning that has not really been the hallmark of our government arguably ever, but certainly not recently. As Jochen noted, the second workshop is going to be at the Library of Congress on October 2nd, hopefully. I would not put it past the state of the world for the government to be shut down for the second day as of October 2nd. I mean, these are real risks that you're dealing with when you're relying on kind of any aspect of government infrastructure at this point. Not to mention the sort of dodgy situation of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which would be a natural funder for an infrastructure project kind of like this. You know things have gotten grim when there's an FAQ on the website that leads with, "Is NEH closed?" And the answer is no, we're okay until October 1st, and then they're doing shutdown funding, except maybe if they're not. Keep your fingers crossed and please keep advocating. Not exactly an inspiring place to be starting in. But rather than dwelling on some nice things that we can't have, let's look for a minute at things that are going on in the US, often in collaboration with international partners, and think about, how does infrastructure actually happen in practice in the US? So the two frameworks that I thought about for DH infrastructure are Cowboys and Consortia. Cowboys being people who go off and just do things, and they do things that people end up relying on. And Consortia being kind of much larger, much more planful, involving more people. Let's look first at Consortia, which are the kind of go-to place for scale and sustainability. If you start a project with the intention of it being infrastructure that's widely adopted, if you plan on it being a big thing, you plan a consortium, often before you even really figure out what the project is doing, but you know that a consortium is going to be part of the arrangement. So Project Bamboo. As I mentioned, this project to develop technical infrastructure to basically be able to scale digital humanities projects and code for anyone to use. We imagined that any scholar could write an algorithm that's useful for computational text analysis, say, and rather than running it on a server in the library under someone's desk, it could run on an enterprise service platform, so that if 100,000 students were to log in simultaneously, they could all run the algorithm flawlessly and with great turnaround time. And then we realized there was also questions about access to collections, and so we went into this great identity and access management thing to try to make it so that anyone could access any collection that they had the rights to through their institution. Things got complicated. One thing that we knew we would have to do was plan this consortium. And we also knew that this was going to be a massive undertaking in and of itself, completely separate from the technical infrastructure. And so while in the early workshops we had some ideas about what a consortium might look like, so we have the explore, plan, and build, and lead, these are the activities that you could do, and then the community members, partners, affiliations there were the different kinds of roles of people that could do those different systems, and you have this spider web here, and then you have the columns and circles, and there's a board. We were spitballing. And then we postponed the consortium until phase 3 of Bamboo, which was then never funded. So I can't tell you what the Bamboo consortium would have looked like, but this is sort of what we were thinking there. It's a lot easier to build a consortium if you're not trying to do everything. Having a more focused goal makes it much easier to sell participation in the project that you're doing. So Tripleif, as Mike mentioned earlier, a way to enable richer access to the world's images. They have an API, a set of standards. They have some viewers. The project started in late 2011 with Stanford and the British Library, among others, and the consortium didn't launch until 2015. That's okay, sometimes consortia take a while. And according to their website, they're still looking for founding members through 2017. So I think some degree of flexibility in what model really works is inevitable, even for a project that is as relatively focused as Tripleif. They note that, contributions provide direct funding for support staff, training and communications, infrastructure, outreach, growth, and adoption of the Tripleif initiative. And to be a member, it's $10,000. Your university contributes that, you have skin in the game, and you have the ability per year. Thank you, Mike. Per year, in order to distribute to show an ongoing commitment. Makes sense. This provides you with the ability to influence and drive local and community benefits via interoperability and supporting and implementing the Tripleif in its successive versions, as they note, as well as shaping what they do with the budget. So basically, you can buy your way into the conversation of shaping the future of this consortium. It makes things go a little bit slower. You're kind of vying with other people who had the $10,000 a year to plunk down, sort of competing for your own interests within the larger framework. But it seems to be a fairly sustainable model, for Tripleif, at least as a kind of technical project. Another project that is maybe less technically oriented, although there are infrastructure components, is the TEI. TEI, in contrast, can have individual members. A person can plunk down $50, probably also per year. And then there are tiers going up to $5,000. And you basically, it's one membership, one vote. So whether you're putting down $5,000 or $50, you have a vote to say, who goes on the board of directors and who goes on the TEI council. And the way the TEI council works, from a presentation actually earlier this week, thanks to Eliza Beshara Bondar and Raf Vigilante, this is the group that takes in the tickets, deals with the requests, thinks about how to implement them, rolls the changes, explains those to the community, and that's how they're able to move along as a consortium. Sometimes things get changed quickly, sometimes things go really slowly. But it's still been, a fairly long-running consortium, a fairly stable one, and a little bit less technical in its orientation, but still extremely valuable as a framework to work in. Now, cowboys. As I was putting together this talk, I first thought of cowboys using the iconic imagery, the lone person riding across the plain. And I was going through my photos, and I came across a picture of my great-great-uncle Dave. Yes, I have actual cowboys in my family. This is my mother's great-uncle Dave. He lived in Montana on a homestead. He was both the school teacher and the preacher in the middle of a land where there wasn't a whole lot else going on. As the person in charge with both the spiritual and the temporal education of everyone nearby, I wonder if he would understand coordinator syndrome if you were to explain it to him in a certain way. He was nomadic, he roamed the countryside, but his driving passion was training horses to dance. And he did. He found wild mustangs and he trained them to prance rhythmically to music, and they performed at fairs and rodeos and parades. And he would show up at my mother's house in Daly City with no notice with his truck and his horse trailer and depart equally with no notice. And hearing this story from my uncle, I realized, there's something to that with this cowboy analogy. In the sense that, again, being tasked with a bunch of different things sort of in your role, this reminds me a lot of various ALTAC positions, where there's a set of things that you're supposed to be doing, you may be driven by other things, and, your ability to show up and disappear, may depend on what job you have at a given time or what resources you have at a given time. And I think this leads to some of the challenges for cowboy projects. So GH Commons, this was me kind of channeling my inner great-great-uncle Dave on a pony. And 20 years later, I had just basically been phased out of Project Bamboo. Project Bamboo had been funded for a second phase, very technically oriented, completely lost a lot of the pieces that I was personally interested in during the planning project. And I was frustrated. I was also 25 and confident that I could do anything with enough coffee and time. And lived in Chicago, where the weather was not great in the summer or the winter, had no children. I had an endless expanse of time on my hands to go save the world. So I went to that camp, Chicago, and there I met Ryan Cordell, who had just started 3 months ago at St. Norbert College in Wisconsin as an assistant professor. And we got to talking. And we were talking about, isn't it hard for projects to find collaborators? Wouldn't it be great if a project could say, hey, I'm working on this project. These are the things that I need. Would anyone like to come help me? And then people could post profiles for themselves and say, hey, I'm interested in working on a project that does computational text analysis or GIS. And a system could match them together and sort of build these collaborations even across different universities, different roles. Wouldn't that be cool? So that night I went home and basically built what became DH Commons in one evening. Showed up to that camp the next day and we talked about it, and we sort of kept building, and we wanted to do more of it. At that point, we were aware of artshumanities.net, another large European infrastructure that was trying to do multiple things at once. Artshumanities.net had projects, it had tools, it had jobs, it had events. It was everything all in one, and it seemed to us that that was likely to make it less stable, where there's just so many things to maintain and different groups of people that are interested in each of those things. So coordinating a whole group of people to keep the whole site up to date was going to be a problem. But we would do it modularly. DH Commons would be the project-based site. And so we also realized that I was a random staff person in IT at UChicago. Ryan was a random assistant professor in Wisconsin. We wanted a little bit more gravitas for our project. We wanted to associate it with something that had name recognition, that had a reputation within the community. And so we got in touch with CenterNet and said, hey, we've built this thing. It could be like a virtual center for people who don't have centers. Are you interested? And they're like, yes, write an MOU. The MOU was approved. I had to Google how to write an MOU at that point. That was approved. And together, we launched this MLA convention workshop on getting started with DH Commons. The project continued on the margins of all of our time. It became the journal of CenterNet. We ended up having an editorial board consisting of Ryan, Isabel Galina, and Laurent Romary, who I know many of you in DARIAH know. And so we were able to keep building this sort of on the sides. None of us really had a lot of time for it, but we were able to make it keep working. Part of it was funded by the Mellon Foundation, which, after shutting down Bamboo, said, there's this dirt thing that you've done as part of Bamboo. We'll fund that as a separate project, just keep it away from Bamboo. It's like, okay, we can do it. We'll rebrand. We'll rebuild, we'll build an API, we'll do integration between DH Commons and Dirt. That way they can each live independently, but still be connected. And Dirt is an interesting story because it's one of the rare cases of a multi-person cowboy project, where Lisa Spiro spun it up as her own cowboy project. In the library, she just started a wiki, a free, freemium platform wiki, threw some tools up there, started promoting it, including, I believe, at the Stanford DH conference. And it got really popular really fast, and people still cite it, years later. Her role changed. She no longer was able to support it, so I took it over under the context of Bamboo in hopes of getting something that was associated with Bamboo that people actually liked and understood. So it split off as its own project and was funded by Mellon to do this integration. Unfortunately, we did need to find an organizational home because I, again, was a random staff member at Berkeley, and especially in a time of budget crises, it's hard to justify spending money on a resource where most of the user base is not at your institution. So we went searching for an organizational home for Dirt, and the two options we landed on were CenterNet, because DH Commons was already there, we knew people there, they were about to get nonprofit status in the US. And as it happens, DARIAH. I'm sad that Sally won't be able to be here in person. I enjoyed talking with her at DH 2014 about the possibility of Dirt becoming part of DARIAH. And now I find myself wondering, how might things have ended differently if we had gone that route? In any case, we talk about organizational home. But home sort of conjures up images of walls and a roof and a shelter in a storm and funding and sustainability and stability. It's occurred to me subsequently that an organizational home is maybe less of a home and more of a pool float. When things are going well, you look really great when you're chilling out on a pool float in a pool on a sunny day. You're associated with something bigger. It adds some gravity to your project. But ultimately, the fact is that if you're dealing with a cowboy project where you're the cowboy, if you can't be the cowboy anymore, then you're basically just trying to pass it off on a bunch of other overburdened volunteers. There isn't, an organizational home, especially in an organization that's sort of a community, social, professional organization. It's no substitute for an actual consortium driven by the thing you're trying to support. So what we discovered was that there are other cowboy infrastructure that's more stable. So TAPOR, the text analysis portal for research, Jeffrey Rockwell's project, it's been around for a really long time. And it still exists. And every time Jeffrey gets a grant, he manages to sort of carve out some funding to help keep TAPOR chugging along. Sometimes there's more grad students supporting it. Sometimes there's fewer. Sometimes there are better tech people supporting it, and sometimes less good. It's more flexible. It goes with the flow. But the fact is, it's associated with him, and he is a tenured professor. And so he has reliable access to resources on an ongoing way, in a way that someone in an LTAC position really can't do. So we ended up basically giving dirt to TAPOR. I'm grateful to Jeffrey for having taken it on, and that's how dirt ended. Dirt is now TAPOR. In the long term, the trajectory is not actually all that much different. When Jeffrey retires and no longer has access to those resources, we're still dealing with the same problems for sustainability. It just sort of draws out the timeline a little bit. And so I think as a larger DH community, we're going to have to start thinking about what's going to become of resources like this as people start to retire. The humanist listserv is another one that I think, as we've all recently seen with the great tech meltdown of 2018, we treat it as if it's always going to be there. And if there's not active intervention, it may not be. So are there better models for infrastructure in the US that are still feasible? Consortia are great, but they're also sort of slow-moving and not as quick to respond to needs and not as quick to adapt. And the cowboy projects are really unstable, and it's dangerous to adopt cowboy projects as infrastructure because you really can't rely on them necessarily being there tomorrow. So I had the opportunity in the last year to work on research computing at Berkeley, which allowed me to get some exposure to different models for infrastructure than things we've necessarily even really thought about in the humanities. And one of them is EXCEED, the Extreme Science and Engineering Discovery Environment. It's one of those words where, if you pronounce it right, you're in the club, XSEDE. And EXCEED is really interesting. It's funded by the National Science Foundation. And the way it works is it's a bunch of different clusters. The different clusters have different characteristics. There's GPU clusters, there's high memory clusters. Each one, more or less, is run by a different institution. And how this works is each institution decides locally, hey, what we really need is a large GPU cluster here. Let's get the NSF to fund it. So if you just write to the NSF and say, dear NSF, please fund my giant cluster, they will say no. But if you say, dear NSF, please fund my giant cluster, and we'll donate X percentage back to EXCEED and run that for you as part of this umbrella organization to provide national compute infrastructure for the whole country, they'll say, yes, no problem, we'll fund your giant cluster. It's simplified somewhat, but more or less. So that's an interesting model. So what if, hypothetically, we were to rethink DH advancement? And I mean, I've been really heartened by the changes at the NEH over the last 5 years or so, where previously it was all about innovation. Everything has to be innovation, and kind of improving things that are broken or old or need fixing, or building things that other people can reuse was downplayed versus innovation. And now they've moderated that somewhat. There's some opportunities to revisit existing projects, kind of buffer up things that are on the verge of collapse or need kind of rethinking in light of modern technologies. But the DH Advancement Grant emphasizes here, reuse and extensibility are hallmarks of this program, leading to innovative work that can scale to enhance scholarly research, teaching, and public programming in the humanities. Sounds like this could be infrastructure. So there's been a couple projects at Berkeley that were funded under this or previous versions of this program. Berkeley Prosopography Services, which was designed to help people kind of disambiguate individuals out of corpora of texts that include names. And prior to that, WordSeer, which was sort of a text analysis and visualization environment. Both of those projects still exist. Berkeley Prosopography Services is kind of adding a few more features. They do expect to run it pretty much until they run out of funding or things break beyond a point where they can fix it. WordSeer is available, again, all open source code. You could run this if you wanted, but let's face it, it's not the easiest thing to do, especially depending on what sort of institution you're at. So what if we thought about reallocating funding? What if we took the funding designed for those programs and reduced it by a third, or maybe even half, and then put the rest of that funding towards running the thing? You would have a commitment, say, to run this software, run this package, run this platform for, say, 5 years. And during that time, anyone could put in an application saying, I need to use this platform, and they would be granted access to do so, and they could do it. It doesn't need to impede the independence of the cowboy. Let the cowboy still build the thing. Let the cowboy envision what this would look like. But then once those creations exist, let them scale better so that other people can benefit from it. It would redistribute some of the beneficiaries of these projects, because let's face it, the projects that we have, this is already happening. If you know the guy, you can get access to the thing. We all run things for our friends, and so it's all about who you know. And that is a model. It's a model that works well enough for people for a given amount of time, but it really does cut out a lot of people from the benefits of these projects. People at small liberal arts institutions, people who don't have the funding to go to the conferences where they can meet the guy who runs the thing that they get access to. What if we had just enough infrastructure over the top to make it possible to kind of mediate some of those relationships and let people get access to these things? What it would also do, though, is redistribute some of the roles. So we like the idea of there being interesting digital humanities roles for people with advanced degrees in the humanities. If we're talking about diverting some of the funding from those fun roles of building things and imagining things and creating things to needing to run infrastructure, we're talking about creating some roles that are a lot less fun to do. And I can tell you, because I've been doing it for the last year. Account creation, not a lot of fun. Project creation, not a lot of fun. Dealing with paperwork, not a lot of fun. But it needs to happen. It needs to happen consistently. You need someone in those roles. And that's that. Maybe those are roles that just shouldn't go to people that have advanced degrees in the humanities. Maybe this is something that someone can be trained to out of undergrad. Maybe someone who doesn't even have a humanities background at all could do some of the parts of it. But that is directing our funding to somewhere different than we have been putting it, and that's worth thinking about. Facilitating the use of some resources has consequences. If you make it really easy to do GIS projects, then more people will be doing GIS projects, whether or not that directs the field, kind of inflecting it in a way that we want as a community. Maybe we do want to say, it's best for everything to be equally hard, and people can choose whatever hard path makes the most sense. All hard paths are equal, everyone for themselves. I don't think that's what we should throw up our hands and do, but there are consequences in terms of what people study, what people write dissertations on, what people get grants for that would come with this that I think deserves some reflection. So there's a role for institutions and disciplines in this. We don't have to rely on funders to lead the way. Kathleen Fitzpatrick from Michigan State University and the president of ACH wrote this very interesting blog post in July on sustainability and solidarity. And she included this tweet. Brett Bobley from the NEH talking about how we sustain scholarly infrastructure, and Hugh Kalis saying, institutions need to step up and take responsibility and fund these things in an ongoing way, otherwise they will die. But I wonder if, without destroying the wonderful alliteration of Cowboys and Consortia, we could think about Cowboys, Consortia, and collectives. Kathleen had a very interesting idea around solidarity as kind of the key thing that might help facilitate sustainability of infrastructure. So solidarity is the prerequisite, recognizing that the interests of the larger group may outweigh the interests of your own institution, realizing that you're part of a bigger thing, and maybe we shouldn't always prioritize what we need locally if it's going to lead to some developments that will benefit the larger community and will then come back to you. So as we build our projects, what if we thought a little bit less about what your project could be the basis of? Thinking less of your project as the cornerstone, upon which great empires will be built, and more looking at what the options are to build on what other people are doing. What if we put in the extra 10, 20, sometimes even 30% to try to bridge the gap between what's been put together already and the ideal of what you need for your own work, to be able to actually build something, even if it's piecemeal, even if it's brick by brick. Realizing that all of our work exists in an ecosystem and not in a vacuum. And so to that end, I'm looking forward to the next few days and learning more about the work that's being done by DARIAH and at Stanford, and thinking about how these things can provide scaffolding for the next generation of scholarship if we're willing to open our minds to thinking infrastructurally. Thank you.